Once a king was walking through the streets of the capital city when he came upon a beggar. And the beggar asked him for money, but the king didn't give him any money. Instead, he invited him to his palace. And the beggar took up the king's offer. On the appointed day, he made his way to the royal palace, and he was duly ushered into the king's presence. However, as he came into the king's presence, he became acutely conscious of his rags and felt ashamed of them. Those rags were an eloquent symbol of the misery and the wretchedness of his life. The king, an exceptionally kind man, received him warmly, took pity on him, and among other things, gave him a whole new set of clothing. The beggar departed the palace in great spirits. However, a few days later, he was back begging on the streets, dressed in his old rags. So why did the beggar give up his new set of clothing? Because he knew that if he wore it, he would have to give up the life of a beggar and make a new life for himself. And this he was not prepared to do. It wasn't that the new life didn't appeal to him. It was just that he knew that it would involve painful changes in his behavior and his way of living. This weekend, we begin our Lenten season. It's a season that challenges us to reflect on our lives and make those painful changes in our behaviors and our ways of living. We might not be wearing rags on our bodies, but all of us have different kinds of rags that we need to shed during this Lenten season in order to refresh and renew ourselves. David Brooks has written two rather provocative articles in the New York Times in the last couple of weeks. The first was entitled "Conflict and Ego," and the other, "The Rigorous Act of Forgiving." Now, in the first one, Conflict and Ego, he writes about the critical vituperative, great word, vituperative, I never heard it before. It means bitter and abusive. The critical, vituperative, and insulting reader comments that he has to deal with every day from his column. He tells us that anyone on the internet today is subject to insult, trolling, hating, and cruelty. He calls this dominance plays. They are attempts by the insulter to assert his or her own superior status through displays of gratuitous cruelty toward some kind of target. He calls it keyboard vengeance. It's a status contest. If someone puffs himself up, then we have to puff ourselves up. And we go back and forth, seeing who can maintain center stage. In the second article, he reflects upon the experience of Brian Williams, that no matter how high you go in life, and no matter how many accolades you win, it's never enough. Never satisfied. Always hungry for admiration. Yes, Brian Williams, like so many of us, needed to puff himself up. But more importantly, what Brooks writes about is the barbaric public response to Williams, the contempt and the mockery that has erupted, the massive attempt to purge him and to ostracize him. And Brooks, in that second article, asks us a very, very important question. He says, would the fabric of our society not be better if instead of trying to sever relationships with those who have done wrong, we try to repair them? If we tried forgiveness instead of exiling? I think we're all aware of the tremendous amount of gratuitous cruelty in our world today. And so much of it has to do with our egos. It's amazing how our ego can destroy ourselves and destroy others. NPR recently did an amazing piece on a woman by the name of Lindy West. Maybe you are familiar with her. I was not. She is a Seattle-based writer, editor, and a performer. And for 3 years, she was harassed on the internet on an everyday basis. She was called horrible names that I couldn't even repeat from the pulpit. And there was this one particular, what they call internet troller, who actually made a Twitter account, a fake Twitter account, purporting to be her dead father. And he called the Twitter account "Embarrassed Father of an Idiot." Now, what's interesting about her experience is that Lindy West found out who was this internet troller, and she confronted him. It was a very powerful experience. When this internet troller was unmasked, he painfully admitted to Lindy West why he became involved in such cruelty. And this is what he wrote: "I think my anger towards you stems from your happiness with your own being. It offended me because it served to highlight my unhappiness with myself." My unhappiness with my own self. What an acknowledgement. So much of our unhappiness is connected with our ego. Our need to be other than who we are, better than others, always competing and enjoying it when others do wrong and make mistakes. David Brooks, in that first article, tells us the best way to respond to this gratuitous cruelty is to step out of the game, to get out of the status competition. That enmity is a nasty frame of mind, and pride is painful. He goes on to say something interesting. He said, the person who can quiet the self can see the world clearly, can learn the subject, and master the situation. He goes on to give us the example of Abraham Lincoln, caught in the middle of a horrific war, who was able to set aside his own indignation for those who started the war. That Lincoln rose above the natural urge towards animosity. Instead, he adopted an elevated stance. And then Brooks refers to the present-day ISIS crisis, calling what they are doing, he said this, attempts by insignificant men to get the world to recognize their power and status. So perhaps our egos are the rags we need to discard this Lenten season. Our egos can lead to conflict, ruining our lives and the lives of others. I think David Brooks gives us a great challenge. Quiet the self. Step out of the status game. Learn to forgive rather than to destroy. Does this sound familiar? It's exactly the message of Jesus in the Gospels. It's exactly the message that Jesus spent 3 years trying to give to all of us. It's the basic challenge of the Lenten season. The beggar's rags were an eloquent symbol of the misery and wretchedness of his life. Our egos can be eloquent symbols of the misery and wretchedness that we cause ourselves and others. The Lenten season offers us a time to quiet ourselves, to get out of the status game, to break the chain, and to begin the attempt of the rigorous act of forgiving, rather than being so critical, so vituperative, bitter and abusive and insulting. In order to make ourselves feel better, at the expense of others. Let us enter into this Lenten season and let us get out of our own egos.